The house on Brindle Street looked smaller than he remembered. Time had folded it inward, softening its outline until it resembled a distant image caught on failing film. The investigator, Jonas Hale, paused under the pale winter sky and drew a slow breath. The cold settled on the back of his throat, dry and metallic, like the air in forgotten storage rooms. He unlocked the door with the same key issued to him decades earlier, a key that should have been turned in but never left his pocket. The hinges gave a soft, complaining creak, the kind that made silence feel sentient. This was where Liora Mayfield, aged 27, had last been seen alive. A woman known for her calm voice, her quiet intelligence, her habit of reading by the kitchen window long after sunset. A librarian's daughter, a night shift caretaker at the Township Museum, a person with no documented quarrels, no list of rivals. Her unique name had hovered in police logs like a strange, fragile artifact. Every time Hale read it over the years, he felt its stillness. She was the kind of person whose absence suggested imbalance, as if the world lost a counterweight it didn't realize it carried. He stepped inside. Dust rose in a muted shimmer through the beam of his flashlight, drifting like captured breath. The old crime scene tape sagged in brittle yellow ribbons. The living room smelled of paper long forgotten in drawers, wood swelling from seasons of moisture, and something faintly sweet, like dried blossoms crushed between the pages of a book. The past had not moved, it waited. Hale advanced with careful steps, avoiding the places he knew once bore markers, small numbered tents that catalogued fragments of a life interrupted. He saw where the old markers had once sat, tiny depressions in the carpet, impressions surviving longer than anyone expected. He felt as though he were walking through silhouettes rather than objects. The evidence seemed like ghosts, faint shapes clinging to the edges of memory. A single framed photograph still sat on the floor where it had fallen years ago. He crouched, knees stiff, and lifted it gently. The glass had cracked in a clean diagonal line, splitting the image of Liora with a quiet distortion. She stood in front of the museum, smiling slightly, one hand curled around the strap of her canvas bag. The expression wasn't joy and wasn't sorrow, just something in between, something observant. Hale had always wondered what she noticed in the world that night, what she feared, if anything. He wiped dust from the frame with the edge of his sleeve. The crack caught the light like a frozen ripple on water. A whisper escaped him, more breath than voice. "You should have solved this." He placed the photo back down, leaning it against the overturned table where it had rested in the original scene. Years ago, this living room had held a quiet hostility, nothing dramatic, just a subtle suggestion that something vital had been removed. No blood, no forced entry, no known struggle. Liora had simply vanished from this house, her belongings left undisturbed except for the few items investigators noted as out of place. A museum key that had not been returned to its hook, a missing notebook, and the position of a chair that seemed angled toward the hallway. Hale moved to that hallway now. The air felt denser there, as if the narrow space carried its own weather. He paused, imagining the muted shuffle of feet, Leora's hand brushing the wall, her final motions before the timeline fractured. "Jonas," a voice had said back then, "there's nothing here, we're chasing shadows." But he had insisted they look deeper, and yet the case froze before it breathed. He stepped into the bedroom where the investigators had spent the longest hours. The room was dim, even with daylight weakly filtering through the faded curtains. He clicked on the dirty lamp out of habit. The switch moved but produced no light. The smell here was different, flatter, older, mixed with the scent of aging fabric and unopened closets. His eyes settled on the empty dresser. This was where Leora's missing notebook had been last seen. A simple journal, brown cover, lined pages. the only item that had eluded them. It had become a quiet obsession, a detail so minor the department dismissed it, but one Hale had never forgotten. She wrote often, but never about anything dramatic, mostly museum inventory notes, personal reflections, small observations about visitors, weather patterns, and daily routines. Why was it the only thing gone? Why take something so ordinary unless it held something that was? He opened the top drawer slowly. It stuck halfway, then gave in with a soft sigh. Old air escaped, carrying a faint hint of lavender. Inside lay a single index card, yellowed at the edges. It hadn't been catalogued before. Someone must have placed it here long after the investigation closed. His pulse tightened. He lifted the card, nothing on the front, but on the back faint pencil writing. Not alone that night. The handwriting was delicate, slanted slightly to the right. It matched samples from Leora's desk files. Hale stared at it, the words rippling through him with a cold, analytical precision. Not fear, not shock, just a sense of gears turning in a mechanism that had stalled for decades. "Why didn't we find you then?" he murmured. The note felt like a whisper pulled from the edge of time, private, hesitant, incomplete. He slipped it into an evidence sleeve he carried out of habit, though he hadn't expected to use one today. The sleeve crinkled softly, a lonely sound. Outside, a wind pressed against the old structure, making the windows hum. Hale stood motionless for a long moment, absorbing the silent weight of the room. He wasn't here to rewrite history. He was here because the past had finally shifted, offering a single, fragile thread. He followed it out of the bedroom, back into the hallway, back toward the living room where the broken photograph leaned. Leora's split image stared through the crack like someone watching him from two moments at once. Time had frozen this place, but anything frozen could fracture. And fractures were where truth began to show. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. The card lay under the forensic lamp in the precinct's quiet evidence room. The bulb hummed faintly, casting a pale glow that brought out indentations invisible to the naked eye. Hale leaned over it with slow, deliberate focus. His breath stayed even, but his mind moved in calculated arcs. Not alone that night. The indentations beneath the phrase suggested hesitation, as if Leora had pressed the pencil too lightly at first, changed her pressure, then continued. The spacing was irregular. This wasn't written in calm reflection. It was written with urgency. A soft knock on the door interrupted the hum. Detective Mara Ellen stepped in, her movements measured, as though respecting the stillness of the place. "You asked for a handwriting comparison," she said, pulled from the old file. He nodded, "Thank you." She placed a thin folder beside him and took a step back. Mara was new to the department, but she handled cold cases with an unusually gentle detachment. She knew when not to speak. Hale opened the folder. Photocopies of Leora's museum inventory logs, night shift reports, and a page from a personal letter lay inside. The slanted script matched perfectly, same curvature, same spacing between words. No doubt, the note was hers. "How did this surface?" Mara asked quietly. "In her dresser," Hale said. "Top drawer, someone put it there later." "Not during the initial search." "No," his voice stayed low, "we would have seen it." Mara absorbed that silently. The implications were clear. Someone revisited the house after the investigation closed, someone who had access, someone who knew exactly what drawers had been checked. "Who had keys?" she asked. Hale already knew the list by memory. Family, landlord, co-workers with after-hours access, and us. Her gaze flicked to him, meaning. meaning the circle isn't large, and someone didn't want the message found too early. Myra walked closer, arms folded loosely. So the case officially reopens. Hale felt the sentence settle into the room like dust. He didn't speak it aloud. He didn't need to. The note had pulled the case back from its frozen state. A small recorder clicked on. Hale pressed the red button, documenting his findings in a clinical tone. Discovery location, condition of card, handwriting match. His voice felt distant in the room, as if narrating someone else's case. He paused, studying the indentations again. They formed faint shadows under the lamp. Something about the depth caught his attention. It wasn't uniform. Some letters showed deeper impressions that suggested the card had been written against a softer surface. A book, perhaps. A notebook. His mind tightened around the missing piece. Leora's brown notebook vanished on the night she did. What if the note was part of it, he murmured, or torn from something she wrote earlier? Myra leaned closer. Could be. He turned off the lamp. We need to find that notebook. The precinct air carried its usual blend of stale coffee and old paper. The halls felt narrower than usual when Hale stepped out, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. He carried the card in its sleeve with mechanical precision, like an object both fragile and heavy. His thoughts pressed back to the original scene. No signs of forced entry, no shouted arguments from neighbors, nothing stolen except one ordinary notebook. That detail had always unsettled him, not enough for a motive, not enough for a pattern, but enough to feel like a breath held too long. He moved toward the archive room. Rows of shelves towered like static pillars. Old case boxes lined them, each labeled with dates and descriptions that felt distant yet immediate. Liora Mayfield's file sat on the lower shelves, thinner than cases that lasted fewer weeks. He pulled it out. The cardboard felt soft from age. Inside were statements, floor photos, timeline logs, interview summaries. Everything memorized, yet everything unfamiliar in hindsight. He flipped through them with steady fingers. The house search report. No note, no card, no indications of writing in any drawers. That meant the card was placed after the search, after police tape came down, after the case dispersed into silence. Someone returned. Someone who believed the note mattered. Someone who didn't want to hand it to the authorities directly. Why hide it, he whispered, unless revealing it would point back to you. A sound at the door made him glance up. Myra. You'll want to see this, she said. Her voice carried a cautious undertone, not alarmed, just prepared. He followed her to the front desk where a box waited. Plain cardboard, unmarked. The clerk explained it had been dropped off anonymously early that morning. Hale examined the box. No label. None, Myra said. He opened it carefully. Inside lay a single object wrapped in old newspaper. The wrapping cracked softly as he unfolded it. A brown notebook, worn edges, faint indentations on the cover where a pencil had once pressed too hard. Leora's missing notebook. It felt like an object resurrected. Hale opened it slowly. The first few pages contained routine notes, museum inventory lists, exhibit maintenance reminders, remarks about humidity levels. But several pages near the middle section had been torn out cleanly. The remaining edges formed soft ridges. He looked at the cover again. Pencil indentations, the same depth pattern as the message card. She wrote that note leaning on this, he said. Myra nodded. Pages missing, could have held something important. Or someone removed them, Hale said, because they did. He closed the book. The new evidence was no coincidence. It was placed, timed. Someone wanted the investigation to move again, but only now. The case had reopened itself. Investigator examines past reports to identify overlooked details. Hale spread the reports across the conference table in a deliberate grid. Old photographs, statement transcripts, neighborhood maps, forensic logs, each paper lay in strict alignment. Mara watched quietly from the end of the table, hands in the pockets of her coat, as though the room's rising tension required stillness. The overhead lights hummed. The building's radiator clicked in steady intervals. Every sound felt amplified in the long room. Hale began with the earliest reports, the ones written within hours of Liora's disappearance. He traced the timeline with the edge of a blunt pencil. Last confirmed sighting, museum exit 11:18 p.m. Witness, caretaker on shift rotation. She walked toward Brindle Street. Mara nodded, same route she always took. He slid the next sheet forward. No activity on her street noted by neighbors between 11 p.m. and midnight. No recorded car engines. No shouts. No window lights reported. He paused on that detail. Too quiet, predictably quiet, almost rehearsed. Mara noticed his pause. Something off. At the time, he said, we assumed the quiet meant nothing happened here, but silence is also convenient. She stepped closer, scanning the reports, meaning someone could have known the street pattern. New neighbors wouldn't notice. He didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the interview transcripts. The landlord. The coworkers. The night shift caretaker. The museum assistant who cataloged artifacts with Liora. The neighbor across the street. A distant cousin who visited twice a year. A local volunteer who helped with museum events. He reorganized them by proximity rather than chronology. The people closest to Liora's routine formed a tight cluster. Patterns emerged when he shifted their order. Gaps appeared too. One transcript caught his eye. A brief statement from the museum assistant, a man named Rowan Latimer. He had been the last person to speak with Liora before she left. The transcript was short, almost too short. Mind if I look at that? Mara asked. He handed it to her without lifting his gaze from the next file. She skimmed it. His responses are clipped, she noted, almost evasive. He wasn't considered a suspect, Hale said. No motive, clean background check. Solid alibi, said he drove to Harrisburg that night. And we never verified it. We did, but his timeline had a 30-minute gap that didn't matter then. Does it matter now? Hale didn't answer. Instead, he pulled an old photograph from the stack. The museum parking lot. Liora's car still there after she disappeared. She had walked home instead as usual. He stared at the photo. The far corner of the lot had a security light that flickered occasionally, a small detail he hadn't thought about since the initial investigation. The light flicker could obscure movement, could distort shadows. He scribbled a note. Parking lot visibility compromised. Next, he reviewed the floor layout of Liora's house. Nothing forced, nothing broken. But the chair angled toward the hallway still bothered him. He had assumed she moved it herself. But what if she did? What if someone sat there, or stood, or waited? He wrote another note. Chair angle suggests presence. Mara circled the phrase. Presence before or after she arrived home. Before, Hale said quietly, most likely. The weight of that possibility pressed into the room. He continued. The missing notebook. The returned notebook. The note card placed deliberately. Pieces that formed no picture yet. He scanned the neighbor reports next. One in particular seemed thin, a vague description of hearing soft movement sometime after midnight. At the time, investigators dismissed it due to lack of specifics. But now, any sound on an otherwise silent street carried weight. Soft movement. Perhaps footsteps. Perhaps a door closing. Hale wrote, reassess neighbor statement, possible timeline shift. Mara leaned on the edge of the table. What about family? Minimal contact, Hale said. They lived 2 states away. Her brother visited before the case. No friction, no inheritance, no disputes. He marked them low priority. The interesting inconsistencies came from closer circles. People who interacted with Liora daily. People who understood her patterns, routines, habits. He moved to the museum logs. Liora had signed off a few minutes later than usual on her last shift. The reason she wrote, final check on gallery lights. Simple. But Rowan Latimer's log showed he left 2 minutes earlier than standard. The deviation was small, but deviations mattered. 2 minutes, Mara said softly. Barely anything. Barely, Hale echoed, but barely is enough. He underlined the timestamp difference. Next, he examined the volunteer's statement. A woman who helped with weekend exhibits. She mentioned lending Liora a book on regional history, a book that wasn't recovered during the search. Hale's pencil paused. Book. Mara frowned. Notebook replacement. No, he said. A book she borrowed, thick, soft cover, could match the depth of indentations from the note card. You think she wrote the message on that borrowed book? Possibly. Where is it now? He didn't know. He flipped to the volunteer roster. Her name, Emery Callan. No follow-up interviews after the first week. He circled the name. The radiator clicked again, slow, measured, like a second hand on a clock. The evidence grid told a story, but not a clear one. Yet, the parts didn't contradict each other. They left spaces where meaning could hide. Hale stepped back, studying the array from a distance. Museum. House. Notebook. Card. People in proximity. Shifts in timing. Silence in a neighborhood. One more detail surfaced from memory. The museum's storage room had no camera installed during that year. Anyone could access it without a trace. Liora often worked alone there. He added it to his notes. Myra stepped beside him. All overlooked details point inward. Inward. Closer to her, someone she knew, someone whose routine blended with hers. He silently agreed. But one truth lingered, sharper than the rest. The person who returned the notebook wanted the case solved. Or wanted it solved in a particular direction. And that was the most dangerous detail of all. The conference room felt colder as evening settled outside the precinct windows. The evidence grid remained spread across the table, its quiet disorder reflecting the expanding uncertainty of the reopened case. Hale stood beside it, arms folded, tracing mental lines between names, timestamps, and objects that once appeared harmless. Now each piece leaned toward suspicion. The suspects formed naturally, like constellations emerging in a dark sky. Not glaringly bright, not immediately clear, just faint shapes that suggested meaning if one stared long enough. Mara pulled up a chair. Let's take them one by one. Hale nodded and began speaking in a measured cadence, each name landing softly in the room. Rowan Latimer, coworker, last to see her. A quiet museum assistant with a habit of working late. His original interview had been short, detached, almost too steady. He claimed he drove to Harrisburg that night, and while the alibi had been loosely verified, the timeline held unexplained gaps. His responses, brief to the point of hesitation, echoed across Hale's memory like faint knocks. Rowan had access to the museum's storage, Mara noted. No cameras, no witnesses, knew her routine better than most. Motive unclear, Hale said, but proximity is strong. Emery Callan, museum volunteer. Friendly, reserved, known for leaving batches of homemade snacks in the staff lounge. She lent Liora a soft-cover regional history book a week before the disappearance. That book had never been found. She denied visiting Liora's house, yet handwriting on the volunteer sign-in sheet placed her at the museum that same evening, though she wasn't scheduled. Mara flipped through Emery's transcript. She said she stopped by to leave flyers for an upcoming exhibit. But the flyers were never turned in, Hale replied. They both paused. She had the book, he continued. A thick one, the kind Liora might have used as a surface. And she never mentioned it again, Mara said quietly. The landlord, Derek Wilson. A man in his 60s at the time of the disappearance, known for punctual rent collection and minimal conversation. He entered Liora's house occasionally for maintenance, always unannounced but permissible in the lease. His original interview contained vague statements, polite, curt, no record of conflict, yet he possessed a duplicate key. Hale circled his name. He had access after the investigation closed. Mara leaned back. Would he plant the card years later? Hard to say, Hale murmured. His life had no known ties to Liora outside the lease. Neighbor Agnes Collar. Elderly, half asleep most evenings, reported soft movement, sometime around midnight on the night of the disappearance. The detail had been dismissed due to her uncertain hearing, but Hale now saw it differently. She lived directly across from Liora. Her window faced the front door. Mara tapped her pencil. If anyone noticed someone entering the house, even quietly, she would have been the closest witness. She saw something, Hale said, even if she didn't realize what. Museum caretaker, Jordan Vess. On shift the same night. He spoke to Liora briefly before she left, claimed to have stayed inside the main gallery until the next shift arrived. His timeline was consistent, but his manner during the first interview seemed strained. Hale remembered the slight tremor in his hands, the way he avoided eye contact when describing her final minutes in the museum. Stress from the situation, Mara asked. Maybe, or something he didn't want to recall. Hale moved to the final name on the list. Relative cousin Michael Barron. Visited Liora occasionally. No documented issues, no unusual financial connections. He had been out of state on the night in question. Alibi solid, but the emotional distance in his interview stood out, detached, mildly impatient. He seemed bothered by the process more than the loss. Mara read his transcript and shook her head slightly. Doesn't feel involved. No, Hale said, but tone isn't evidence. The suspects formed a circle around Liora's final night. Not in loud or dramatic fashion, but quietly, steadily, like a tightening noose woven with simple threads. Access, familiarity, silence. Hale placed the brown notebook in the center of the table. Its worn cover absorbed the dim, overhead light. The missing pages pulsed with implication. Each suspect held a possible fragment of the truth. Someone knows where these missing pages went, Mara said. Someone removed something they didn't want found, Hale replied. He flipped through the notebook again, reading Liora's careful handwriting, small notes about gallery humidity, broken display glass, a missing label from an exhibit drawer. Mundane observations. Nothing that suggested fear, nothing that predicted what would come. Then he reached the indentation-heavy pages, the ones adjacent to where sheets had been torn out. Faint outlines of letters remained, like shadows pressed into paper. He tilted the notebook. Light caught the impressions. "Can you read any of it?" Mara asked. He narrowed his eyes. The shapes were incomplete, broken by removal, but certain strokes resembled letters, maybe an R, maybe an L, possibly the beginning of a name. Not enough to accuse, enough to unsettle. The room stayed silent for several breaths. Mara finally spoke. Every suspect connects to her routine. Someone knew her movements so well the entire crime carried no noise. No struggle, Hale added. No forced entry, no alarm. Someone she trusted. Or someone who moved like part of the background. The idea hung in the air, heavy. In old cases, the most overlooked suspect was often the person whose presence blended with the environment, a shadow mistaken for absence. Hale marked each name with 3 categories. Access, opportunity, silence. Rowan, strong, strong, uncertain. Emery, medium, medium, strong. Caretaker Jordan, strong, medium, ambiguous. Landlord, strong, low, strong. Neighbor, low, low, unintentionally high. Cousin, low, low, low. Patterns began to form. Emery and Rowan kept rising on the list, subtle inconsistencies, proximity to the museum, to Liora, to her routine. But Emery had one additional detail. She was the only one who mentioned the book. And the book was now the most important missing object besides the torn notebook pages. Hale closed the file slowly, as though sealing a shift in direction. The suspects weren't yet accusations. They were shadows moving closer. "We talk to Emery again tomorrow," he said. Mara nodded, and Rowan. "After her," Hale replied. "Emery's story has the softer edges. Softer edges hide more." The radiator clicked once more, loud, abrupt, like a punctuation mark. Night settled fully outside. The list of suspects stood quietly on the table, each name waiting in the dim light. And the case, long silent, began to breathe. Clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. Hale knocked lightly on Emery Callan's door. The small townhouse sat at the edge of Midtown, its garden filled with dry, frost-bitten stems. Mara stood beside him, hands tucked into her coat. The sun hung low, cold and diffused. Emery opened the door almost immediately, as if expecting someone. Her expression shifted, surprise first, then a soft, unreadable calm. "Detective Hale," she said in a gentle voice, "it's been years." Hale nodded. "We'd like to ask a few follow-up questions if you don't mind." She stepped aside without hesitation. Inside, the living room smelled of tea and old books. Shelves lined the walls, filled with regional histories, museum guides and binders labeled with years. Mara glanced around subtly. "You kept volunteering after Liora." "Yes," Emery said. "The museum needed help. Routine helps with," she paused, choosing her words, "with keeping things steady." Hale studied her movements, slow, deliberate, but not outwardly nervous. "We're revisiting a few details," he said, "particularly the book you lent Liora." A small tremor in her hands as she set her mug down, barely noticeable, but there. "Oh," she said, "that one. I tried asking about it after the case was closed, but I assumed it was lost." "Do you remember the title?" Mara asked. "Echoes of the Valley," soft cover, gray spine. Emery hesitated. She liked reading local histories. Hale observed her closely. "Did you ever enter her house, even once?" "No," Emery shook her head quickly. "She invited me once for tea after a long shift, but I didn't go. I prefer routine, familiar spaces." A soft conflict pulsed in her voice, something introspective, restrained. Hale shifted the conversation. You were at the museum the same evening, though you weren't scheduled. Yes, Emery said, eyes dropping to the floor. I dropped off flyers for a weekend event. You didn't give them to the staff, Mara said gently. Another pause. Emery's breath tightened slightly. I left them in the break room. Maybe they were thrown out accidentally. Hale stepped closer, not threatening, just deliberate. Emery, why were you really there? Her eyes lifted, damp with something unspoken. I wanted to speak with her, she said quietly, but she was finishing her shift. I thought it better not to disturb her. She always worked with such focus. That's all, Mara asked. A long silence followed. Emery looked toward the shelves, toward the book spines. Her voice softened. She had this way of making you feel seen, she whispered. In a calm way. I admired that. I just wanted to tell her something, but I lost the courage. Emotional conflict surfaced like a ripple beneath calm water. Not guilt. Something closer to unresolved affection, perhaps admiration. But admiration rarely produced violence, unless mixed with something else. Did she know, Hale asked, that you wanted to speak with her? No, Emery said quickly. No, she didn't. Hale believed her. The emotion here was soft, hesitant, not predatory. But emotion alone wasn't evidence. He scanned the bookshelves again. Dozens of volumes, but the gray-spined regional history was not among them. Mind if we look at your shelves? He asked. She nodded faintly. Myra moved methodically, her fingers hovering over titles. No gray spine. Hale turned instead to the hallway. A small table sat there with a stack of older books, some worn, some unopened. He sifted through them. No gray spine. Then he saw it, an indentation on the wooden surface. Rectangular, slightly larger than a paperback. Dust patterns on the table indicated a book had sat there until recently. Where is the book now? He asked quietly. Emery's gaze flinched. I donated some to the museum last month. Which ones? I can't remember all. Hale held her gaze steadily. Her conflicted breaths, her avoidance, all pointed to something she was withholding, but not necessarily about guilt. Emery, he said softly, was the book ever returned to you? She closed her eyes slowly. Yes, it was left at my doorstep 2 years after the case closed. I didn't know who left it. Did you open it? No, she hesitated. I was afraid it would reopen everything. Where is it now? Mara asked. Her voice broke slightly. I don't know, it disappeared again. Disappeared. She nodded. A year later, I never saw it again. Hale glanced at Mara. Emery's emotional conflict was genuine. Fear, confusion, maybe guilt for not coming forward earlier. But none of it aligned with the cold precision of what happened to Liora. Thank you, he said. We may follow up again. When they stepped back outside, the air felt heavier. Mara exhaled slowly. She's hiding something, she said. Yes, Hale replied, but I don't think it's the crime. He turned toward the street, where the winter wind moved softly along the houses. Someone moved that book, he said, twice. And someone placed the notebook in that box. Mara watched him. You think it's the same person? Hale nodded. Someone who's been curating the evidence. Why would they return it now? His eyes narrowed slightly, as though tracing a faint line through fog. Because they want us looking at the wrong emotional conflict. That points to Rowan, Mara said. Or someone quieter, Hale murmured. Someone who blends into routine. The street felt still, too still. The silence pressed like a held breath. Clues had emerged, subtle, emotional, inconsistent. But the real conflict was still waiting, quieter, deeper. Unexpected twist reveals the least suspected person as killer. The museum halls were dim when Hale and Mara arrived after hours. The director had granted access to storage, archives, and volunteer logs. The building carried a low, hollow quiet, the kind that echoed small sounds into long shadows. Hale moved down the side corridor, the brown notebook tucked under his arm. Something had begun to pull at his thoughts, an idea forming not from coincidence, but from a pattern of silence. Mara followed him to the storage room. "You think the missing pages connect here?" "Maybe," he said, "or maybe the person who took them does." They entered. Shelves lined with labeled boxes filled the room. The air smelled faintly of old paper and cleaning solution. Hale flipped the light switch. A single bulb flickered overhead, pooling a weak glow. He walked directly to the volunteer log drawer. Something about Emery's story, about the book vanishing twice, felt orchestrated. Not by her, but by someone who had access to both the museum and her doorstep. Someone invisible. Someone who knew routines. Someone who moved like part of the background. He opened the drawer. Volunteer logs, attendance sheets, maintenance charts. He flipped through until he found something unusual, a cross-reference sheet dated 3 days before Liora disappeared. It logged who entered the storage room that week. Rowan, Jordan the caretaker, Emery, and one more name. Hale froze. Mara stepped closer. "What is it?" He turned the page slowly, almost unwillingly. A signature, small, slanted, nearly identical to the one on the note card. Agnes Collar. The neighbor. The least suspected person. Quiet, elderly, seemingly uninvolved. But she had volunteered at the museum that week. She had access. She knew Liora's routine, not from affection but proximity. And she had been dismissed entirely from suspicion. Hale's breath tightened. Not from shock. From logic falling into place. The emotional conflicts of others were distractions. The silence on the street wasn't coincidence. The missing book. The missing pages. The returned notebook. The note card in the drawer. All acts of someone who hovered close, unnoticed, living in the margins. Agnes Collar had been guiding the investigation. Not to reveal the truth, but to control its path. Hale closed the folder slowly, the weight of the twist pressing into the room. "Agnes," he whispered, "she was there all along." The next morning, frost clung to the edges of the windows at the precinct. Hale sat alone at his desk, the volunteer logs open before him. The name Agnes Collar hovered on the page with quiet insistence, as though waiting to be acknowledged after years of being overlooked. Mara entered, her coat still dusted with cold air. "You're sure?" she asked softly. "No coincidences," Hale said. "Only patterns, and hers fits the cleanest." Agnes had been the perfect absence, elderly, soft-spoken, described by neighbors as gentle, nearly invisible. But invisibility was a kind of access in itself. People ignored what seemed harmless. Investigators, too. "She didn't mention volunteering," Mara said. "Not once." "Because the museum connected her to Liora's final week," Hale replied. "She couldn't risk it." He spread the documents across the table with slow precision. She had direct access to the storage room same week, same time. She lived across from Liora, she knew her habits, and she had the least monitored house in the neighborhood. "And the book," Mara asked, "left at Emery's door." "Agnes lived next door," he said. No one would have questioned her walking down the porch steps. She could place evidence wherever she wanted without drawing attention. Myra breathed out slowly. Why the notebook then? Why the note card now? To control the temperature of the case, Hale said. To keep it cool, warm it when necessary, cool it again, but not let it die. Then why reawaken it now? He paused. That answer felt heavier, like walking into a room where the air itself pressed against the lungs. Because guilt changes shape, he said quietly. Sometimes it hardens, sometimes it spreads. They drove to Brindle Street in measured silence, the kind that allowed thoughts to settle into place. Agnes lived in the small white house with the slanted porch roof. The structure looked fragile, as though built from thin memories rather than lumber. Agnes opened the door after one soft knock. She blinked at them, mild confusion masking something else, calculation maybe. "Detective Hale," she said, "I haven't seen you in years." He studied her face. Gentle lines, steady eyes, the faint scent of tea clinging to her sweater. A person who would have never crossed anyone's list. Precisely why she had. "Agnes," he said with quiet restraint, "we need to talk about the museum." Her expression tightened, just slightly. A muscle near her jaw twitched. A small movement, but in investigative work, small movements were earthquakes. "I don't remember much," she whispered. "You remember enough," he said. In her living room, surrounded by porcelain cups and framed photos of distant relatives, Agnes finally exhaled a tremor of breath. "I didn't mean for anything to happen," she said. "I only followed her to return something, a misunderstanding." Her voice shook as though each word weighed too much. "We argued," she continued. Not loudly, not long. She stepped back toward her doorway, lost her footing, fell. "I didn't," her breath fractured. "I didn't think anyone would believe it wasn't intentional." "And the evidence?" Mara asked. "I panicked," Agnes said in a fragile whisper. "I kept the notebook, then the book. Then I put things back when I couldn't sleep. I thought if I controlled the pieces, the truth would stay quiet." She closed her eyes. "But truth hums," she said, "even in silence." Her hands shook until she set them flat on her knees. Hale watched her quietly, no judgment in his posture, only an investigative stillness, a human quiet. The least suspected person. A life shaped by routine, a night shaped by accident, a secret shaped by guilt. The case had turned not on drama, but on soft steps, a quiet street, and one overlooked participant who carried the truth longer than she could bear. Ends with moral reflection. Truth isn't always visible on surface. 1,000 words. The case file closed with a muted snap, the kind that felt more ceremonial than final. Hale sat in the empty conference room as the winter afternoon dimmed into early dusk. The lights were off. Only the gray outside illuminated the edges of the documents. Agnes had given a full statement, a fragile, faltering confession shaped by decades of silence. She described that night in a quiet voice, the shadows on Liora's porch, the attempt to return the borrowed book, the soft argument that drifted no louder than a sigh, a stumble backward, a fall, a moment that happened faster than breath. And then the fear. Not malicious, not calculated, just fear. She had removed the notebook to hide signs of their disagreement, removed pages she believed linked her to the moment, hid the book, placed the note card years later when guilt gnawed at the edge of her sleep, returned the notebook in a plain box when she felt the truth stirring again. A long chain of quiet acts, each one meant to bury a moment she could not unlive. No violence, no dramatic motive, just the tremor of human error. Mara stepped into the room, her steps soft, her presence steady. "You going home soon?" she asked. "In a while," Hale said. She sat across from him. I read her full statement. "It's subtle." "Subtle," Hale repeated. "That's what makes it real." He tapped the notebook gently, as though afraid the worn cover might collapse. The phrases Liora had written, mundane, gentle, felt almost sacred in the aftermath. "She didn't deserve quiet disappearance," Mara murmured. "No one does." They sat in stillness for several moments, the kind of silence that didn't demand conversation. Finally she said, "What are you thinking?" Hale leaned back, eyes lifting toward the dim window. "That truth doesn't always shine," he said. "Sometimes it hides, softens, blends into background noise." Mara nodded slowly, "And sometimes the one who seems least capable is carrying the heaviest secret," Hale finished. The radiator clicked, echoing through the room like a punctuation mark at the end of an unspoken sentence. He collected the documents methodically, not rushed, not slow, just steady. The investigative rhythm he'd lived by for decades. Each report slipped into the folder with a soft whisper. He paused on the photo of Liora, the broken frame from the house. Her expression, that faint in-between smile, felt deeper now, more knowing. "What will happen to Agnes?" Mara asked. Hale exhaled gently. "The legal system will handle the facts, but the facts can't touch everything." He closed the folder. "Some truths stay lodged in people," he said, "no matter what's written in reports." Mara absorbed that quietly. She stood and walked toward the doorway, then paused. "You did right reopening this," she said. He didn't answer, not because he disagreed, but because the word right felt too clean for what the case had become. After she left, Hale remained seated a while longer. The room grew darker, shapes blending into softer outlines. The case folder rested beside him, slimmer now, but heavier in a different way. He thought about the first day he entered Liora's house, dust drifting in still light, the cracked photograph staring back, quiet ghosts lingering in the hallway. He thought about the missing notebook, the returned box, the faint pencil marks. Each clue so small it barely existed, yet each one held a pulse of truth beneath its surface. Small clues, quiet people, unspoken motives. And a truth that refused to die, even when buried in silence. He stood finally, stretching stiff joints, and walked to the window. Outside, Brindle Street lay in the early dusk, houses quiet, lights beginning to glow one by one. Ordinary lives unfolding in unremarkable rooms. A street that had once held a secret so soft no one heard it until decades later. He watched his breath fog the glass lightly. The world didn't brighten at the truth. Didn't darken either. It simply shifted. A recalibration. A quiet correction. And maybe that was all justice ever was. A mechanical process, steady and neutral, moving in its own rigid lines. It didn't heal, it didn't soothe, it finished the work. But something human lingered afterward, in the cracks between facts. Memory. Regret. The faint hum of what could have been. He picked up the folder and held it by his side. When he finally turned off the conference room light, the darkness swallowed the table in an instant, leaving only the dim window and the shape of a man walking down the hallway, carrying a case that would never be fully closed inside him. Truth, he realized, was rarely visible on the surface. It lived underneath, quiet, patient, waiting for someone to stop long enough to hear its softer sound. And on a cold Pennsylvania street, in a small, dim room, truth had finally spoken. Its voice was barely more than a whisper. But it was enough.